Okay, now we are continuing with our fourth evidence for God's existence. We've already done three. And remember, we're building a case for Christianity, and we're really preparing ourselves to be able to answer objections that might be offered about Christianity by covering issues related to truth and now God's existence before we get to issues related to Christianity. We're talking about material from the book that I wrote called God's Crime Scene. Now, this is a book that examines the evidence in the universe to see if the most reasonable inference is God. And we started off talking about the nature of the crime scene itself. Remember, in death scenes, we're not quite sure it's a crime scene until we compare the evidence to the explanations. Well, we're doing the same kind of thing here, where we're looking at the evidence in the universe and asking the question, what's the best explanation for these 8 attributes of the universe? It's going to be one of these 2 explanations, either staying inside the room of the natural universe or jumping outside the room. And we're going to be talking in this session about this next to last attribute of the universe, the existence of transcendent, objective moral truths. Now, what's interesting about this is we started off with truth. We started off with truth for a reason, because it turns out that we can make a case for the existence of objective truth claims, including objective moral truth claims. And now the question becomes, well, what's the best explanation, though? These things exist. We've already made a case for that. The question is, how do we explain their existence? Now, I learned a lot about this from working gangs. And I worked gangs for a couple of years. And this is what I looked like back in those days, working gangs. And I had a case once involving a guy named Jesse. Jesse had been accused of torturing a rival gang member. But when I interviewed him, he basically said, you know what, it was okay for me to do this. He felt like, hey, you know what, there's a code. Like all of us who are gangsters, we have our own code. And this guy made an unwarranted pass at my sister, and he broke the code. So the due punishment for that code is he believed this was in other words, there is a law even for those who break the law. And this rival gang member had broken that law. And so therefore, he felt no problem in doing what he did to him. And that started me thinking about kind of a hierarchy, a moral or a legal hierarchy. And you know, there does exist a hierarchy. You'd even know it from your own practical experience. In other words, Jesse had his own beliefs as a gangster. Now, it turned out, though, that he had to bend a knee, basically, to the moral views of the gang in which he belonged. So he might have had his own views about things, but at some point he says, no, I embrace the collective view of my gang related to these kinds of issues, wherever the issue may be. Now, although that was true, his gang does live within the confines of Los Angeles County. So there are some municipal codes within Los Angeles. For example, you might not feel like you should be ticketed for parking on that curb in Los Angeles County, but it turns out, sorry, if you're going to live here, you're going to have to bend your knee to the municipal codes. You're going to get a ticket. And if you don't pay that ticket, you're eventually going to go to jail. So it turns out that while Jesse held his own views about morality, he bent his knee to the next higher up hierarchy and to his gang. And they, of course, whether they liked it or not, if they live in Los Angeles, they're going to have to bend their knee to the Los Angeles hierarchy. But of course, Los Angeles is within the state of California. So there are larger statutes within Los Angeles that apply to people living in Los Angeles, and therefore apply to Jesse, who lives in Los Angeles, and to his gang that resides in this area. And of course, you know, there's another hierarchy of laws, moral laws, related to federal laws that overarch the entire country. And if you believe, now look, not everyone agrees that the United Nations has any power or should have any power, but we have a sense, at least ideally, that there might be a League of Nations that would somehow dictate what every nation within that league ought to do. Here's my question. How far does this go? Like how high does the moral hierarchy extend? That's a good question, I think. And that's why we asked the question I asked in the first session or the second session related to moral truth, to truths at all. Is it ever okay to torture babies for the fun of it? It seems to us, to me, and if it's not okay to torture babies for the fun of it, like what level of this hierarchy makes this determination? If I'm at the bottom level here, Jesse clearly thought it was okay to torture somebody in response. Now, even he might say it's not for the fun of it. Does it reside here? Like, how high up the hierarchy does this have to go? Because if it's just here as a matter of statehood, would it be okay then if I passed a law in Arizona that says it's okay to torture babies? Well, no, we'd say there's like some federal, okay, was it okay for some nations to torture babies when others don't? In other words, doesn't it seem reasonable that this premise that it's never okay to torture babies for the fun of it is a transcendent, it resides somewhere up here. Like people groups don't get to choose this, because if that's the case, then if one people group says, look, for us, it's okay, we'd be powerless to stop them. These are people groups. But it turns out that it's not a matter of people groups. It turns out that people groups, all moral laws are between people groups. Would you agree? In other words, I have no obligation to treat my police car in a certain way. I have no obligation, moral obligation to treat my flashlight in a certain way. These are just objects that I use. And I have no, for example, obligation to physics. There's no obligation to the laws of physics. If there are people who think that the only thing that govern the universe are the laws of physics, well, you only have moral obligations to people groups. Have you ever thought about that? It's not just that there are objective moral truths. It's that the obligations we hold are only to other persons. You have an obligation to your partner who's in the car with you, even though you have no obligation to your car. Think about that. So my question is, if there is an objective standard for truth, like if the idea that it's not okay to torture babies for fun is objectively, transcendently true, that it does not reside in my gang, it's beyond my gang, it's above my gang, it's above the state, it's above the federal, it's above nations. If there is a Star Trek universe in which there are Klingons, it's not okay to torture Klingon babies for fun. This is actually something that transcends even other species on other planets. If that's the case, then the question is, this is clearly then a transcendent objective claim about morality. But since all moral claims are between persons, wouldn't it be fair to ask who is the transcendent objective person to whom we are feeling obligated? Look, on the flip side of this, if there is no objective, transcendent person to whom we are obligated, well, then we're just as Richard Dawkins says, right? And he wrote a book where he says the universe we observe has precisely the properties that we would expect or should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no real evil, and no real good. Nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. By the way, if the universe is governed by just physics and chemistry, acting on space, time, and matter, can you see that there would have to be blindless, pitiless indifference, because there is no being that has sight to see this. There is no being. Now, look, you really can't argue about evil or why God would allow evil if, in fact, there is no God. It's just physics. So the question then becomes, is there some better way to explain? We talked about this. This is why this all works together. I gave you 3 lessons on truth for a reason, because they feed into our 4 lessons on God's existence. Look, if moral truths just come from individuals, we can stay inside the room of the universe to get them, because we as humans are inside the universe. If moral truths come from just people groups, well, then we can stay inside the universe to get them, right? Or if this is the 3 options people typically offered. Either they come from people, or they come from groups, or there are no moral truths. They're simply an illusion. And I've seen people argue for that too. Well, either way you argue this, you can get these 3 explanations by simply staying inside the natural universe. And that's why I think these explanations are offered inside the room. If we can stay inside the room by just saying, hey, number 1, they're just people groups, or but you already know the problem with this. You're saying basically, that if it's just people who get to decide what is morally true, then you really could not deny any action as being morally equivalent to any other action, unless you're willing to say that somebody else as a person is not equal to you. Because if all moral truths come from people, to argue that one moral truth is bad compared to good, you're really arguing that that person is bad compared to good, because that's all moral truths are just simply grounded in people. And I don't think that's going to be effective. And there's no way to admit to evaluate one moral claim against another unless you're willing to say, well, you're just a bad person. And the same is true, of course, for cultures. Number one, that there are, you would basically, could you have a cultural, a moral reformer? If you're saying that all moral truths simply come from cultures, that means that the majority decides what's morally righteous and what's morally vile. But that means you could never have any reformers. Every reformer who comes into culture starts off in the moral minority, trying to convince the culture that the moral majority is wrong. But if values, if moral truths are defined by the moral majority, then anyone in the moral minority is actually immoral by definition. In other words, there could be no true moral reformers if you're saying, no, whatever the majority says is true, even from a moral perspective. Then why try to argue with that? You couldn't change it, because by definition, you're starting off from an immoral position. Do you see the problem with that thinking? It is problematic. And of course, our common experience tells us that you cannot ignore moral truths unless you, and by the way, we're seeing this right now in culture where people are trying to argue that we need to why enforce laws that are grounded on moral principles? Well, if you stop enforcing them, does not get rid of the fact that some things are morally virtuous and some things are morally vile. Our common everyday experiences tells us that this is the case. You can ignore moral truth or deny moral truth exists, but you're doing so at your own peril. On the other hand, there's a third option. The third option is that moral truths come from a moral truth giver. That this personal obligation we feel is because we are obligated not to laws of physics or the power of physics, but we're obligated to a person who is the source of moral law. And this means, though, of course, we have to jump outside the constructs of what we talked about. Look, if there is a transcendent, supernatural moral being that is the source of moral law, we have to jump out of our strict limits of physics, chemistry, acting on space, time, and matter. And this is why someone like a Jerry Fodor, who is a philosopher and a cognitive scientist, says it this way: science is about facts, but not norms. It might tell us how we are, but it couldn't tell us what's wrong with how we are. There couldn't be a science of the human condition. This is why we look to a source that's outside of space, time, and matter, a personal source of moral truth and obligation. But of course, if that's the case, we're outside of the limits of space, time, matter, physics, and chemistry. We are now talking about something outside the room. And by the way, we're not saying that God creates these moral laws. And could he create them differently? He could have made a world in which it'd be okay to torture babies for fun. Now, that'd be kind of willy-nilly. We're not saying that. We're also not saying that it was always wrong to torture babies for fun, even if there was no God. We're saying, because if that's the case, you have one of two options. One is is this capriciously deciding what is morally true and what is morally false, what is morally virtuous, what is morally vile. And that seems arbitrary and random. Or we're saying that these things are so powerful that God could not deny them, in which case we don't need God. If these things transcend even God, if these moral claims transcend even God, we don't need God. No, what we're saying is a third option, that the moral laws simply reflect his nature. If you put salt in the soup, it becomes salty. God is in the universe. He created the universe. Therefore, it reflects his moral nature. It also reflects his logical nature. And this is not something that is creating logical laws or he's creating moral laws. It's simply that he's the salt in the soup. You will taste saltiness if there's salt in the soup. You experience and recognize moral truths and logical truths because God is in the mix. We are in a universe that God created, and it reflects his nature. So that's why we would say that God is the best explanation, but he's outside the room. So now we have looked at 4 of the 8 evidences. You can read the book, God's Crime Scene, if you want to go any deeper, but I just wanted to give you at least float across the surface. Also, what I'm doing here is giving you the 4 aspects of the universe that I did talk about very briefly in Cold Case Christianity, even though I deep dived them in God's Crime Scene. So next we will be turning a corner and moving from, does God exist? Is there truth? To, is Christianity the true view, the true description of God? And we'll be doing that in the next session.